Breaking news. After Donald Trump's executive order targeting voting was halted by a federal judge, the Department of Justice surprisingly said it will not appeal. Welcome back to Democracy Docket. I'm Marc Elias.
And I'm Paige Moskowitz. Let's get started.
All right, Paige, good news out of federal district court in Washington, D.C. This is a case that we have covered very closely here at Democracy Docket. Donald Trump issued an executive order that targeted voting in a variety of ways that we'll get into. And the Department of Justice had a quick defeat. Two key provisions of that executive order, one involving the proof of citizenship that has been so controversial, was blocked by a federal district court judge. We all sort of expected that we would see a quick appeal by the Department of Justice to the D.C. Circuit, because that's, after all, what they do. They appeal losses that Donald Trump has. And of course, Donald Trump cares a lot about being able to suppress voting rights. But in a filing in that case, in that federal district court case, the Department of Justice indicated it is not going to appeal that loss.
At the center of Trump's anti-voting order is an instruction to the Election Assistance Commission, the EAC, to add a proof of citizenship requirement to the National Voter Registration Form. Marc, as you and I have talked about before, as we've talked about with the SAVE Act, with DPOC provisions in general, the fact of the matter is that one, non-citizens are not voting in U.S. elections, so there's no problem to be solved. And two, when you add a proof of citizenship requirement, what you actually do is disenfranchise millions of Americans who do not readily have access to their birth certificate or U.S. passport or another form of documentation proving their citizenship.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, we've talked a lot about this in prior episodes of Democracy Docket. And if you're not already a subscriber to Democracy Docket's YouTube channel, please hit the subscribe button and make sure you hit the bell too. That will make sure you get notifications whenever Paige and I post new videos. But, one of the things that we have covered in these past episodes, Paige, is that this provision, which Republicans like to call proof of citizenship, documentary proof of citizenship, is really just a big voter suppression bill. It is a way of preventing people from being able to register to vote unless they have handy with them either a valid U.S. passport or an original certified birth certificate. Now, many of the people out there watching this, they don't have a passport because they're not planning on traveling abroad. And if they have it, they may not have it with them. And they certainly don't have the original birth certificate or a state certified copy, because, that's not the kind of documentation most people have handy with them when they want to go register to vote. And because of these requirements, there are a couple of second order effects, Paige, that I just quickly want to discuss with you before we talk about what the Department of Justice is up to here in not appealing. The first order effect is what it will do to young voters and first-time registrants who will now effectively have to register in person if this requirement goes into effect. You can't really register online this way. You can't really register easily by mail this way. So it's going to really make it much, much harder for people to register. But the second thing, Paige, is a lot of attention's been focused on what this would mean for women who are married and change their last name when they get married, because at that point, the birth certificate option really becomes unavailable to them without a second document, which would have to connect up the birth certificate name with the name that they currently have on their photo ID. And that's not always, an easy connection to make.
Right. It's estimated that about 70 million American women have gotten married and changed their name. So the name that they have right now on their driver's license or even their passport may not match what's on their birth certificate. So like you said, you may need to show a marriage license or a divorce decree to show proof of that name change, that story along the way of how that person's name may have been changed. And again, this isn't hypothetical. We have seen examples in states like New Hampshire, which do have a documentary proof of citizenship requirement, where it has been reported that women had to make multiple visits to a polling site or election office, bringing different forms of documentation to show how their name had changed over the years.
Yeah, and I just want to quickly say, because I've made this point before, and I think it's really important. People may say, well, what's the big deal? Well, I can assure you the states are not going to take a marriage license that's not certified, right? They're not going to take a photocopy of that. because they're not taking a photocopy of anything else. So why would they take a photocopy of that? So you're going to need an original there. The same with, by the way, a divorce decree, right? You'd have to get a raised sealed copy from the court. I mean, this is just a trap to make it harder for people to be able to register to vote when, as you point out, there is no problem. Like this is voter suppression simply for the sake of voter suppression. It doesn't solve anything. It's not reducing fraud. It's just making it harder to vote. But Paige, we got to pivot to the big news here, the breaking news, which is that the Department of Justice chose not to appeal this loss. Now, this is a case that was brought by the Democratic Party, which I had the honor of representing, along with various nonprofit organizations, including the League of Women Voters and LULAC. And we, just speaking for myself, I assumed that the Department of Justice would appeal because we see the Department of Justice appealing so many of their court losses when Trump issues executive orders that get struck down. And we know that the president cares a lot, specifically about voter suppression, election denialism. So this seemed like, kind of a no-brainer. But, perhaps they read the room, shall we say, that this was not a particularly close call. And we can get into why that is, that the Constitution specifically does not give the president this power that he aggregated to him, took for himself. But it is something that DOJ didn't appeal.
Right, Mark. And what had happened in this case is that the federal judge in DC had issued what's called a preliminary injunction. This wasn't a final ruling on the merits, but, she said, I've seen enough that we can stop this order while litigation continues. And what she had laid out really clearly in her ruling for this PI is that the Constitution is clear that the president doesn't have the power to just enact election policy. Even more so, the president doesn't have the power to change laws passed by Congress, which is what had happened here. Congress had passed the National Voter Registration Act, directing the creation of this national voter registration form. It laid out the requirements for it. In this executive order, Trump tried to change what was on that form, and the judge said very clearly, that is not how this works in the United States of America.
Yeah. And I have to assume that, and I have to assume that the lawyers at the Department of Justice, took a look at that court's ruling and at the Constitution and just decided that, this one's not going to go their way. And so all they are doing by elevating this case up to the DC Circuit is giving a higher court the opportunity to rule against them. And in some of these cases, I've started to wonder whether they are just like, it is better to take a loss at the trial court, not create broader precedent that can be cited more nationally, and move on. Now, obviously, at the end of the day, the decision of whether to appeal if and when the court issues final relief, final permanent relief, we'll see at that point. But the fact that it's a preliminary injunction may sound like this will only be in effect for a short period of time. Preliminary injunctions last during the pendency of the rest of the case, which, depending on a whole host of factors, might take some time, may take longer or not as long. But Paige, it's also important, I think, to put this in context against some of what Democracy Docket is otherwise seeing, which is a wave of these DPOC laws, these documentary proof of citizenship laws. You mentioned the SAVE Act, which is Congress's effort, essentially, to do the same thing. But we've also seen it in the states.
We've seen lawmakers in about 24 states introduce some form of DPOC legislation. Now, there are states that have enacted this. Arizona was the first state to have a documentary proof of citizenship law. They've had it for, 10, 15 years at this point. We saw New Hampshire come along. We're seeing
it's been a mess for them, by the way.
And it has been a mess for them, right? Because of this national voter registration form not having a DPOC requirement. If you will recall, weeks before the 2024 election, there was a lot of back and forth in Arizona about what to do with a group of so-called federal-only voters, people who registered to vote, didn't provide documentary proof of citizenship, and were only eligible to vote in federal elections. The DMV may have miscoded them. There were people who maybe should have been federal-only voters, but were full ballot voters, and vice versa. It's an administrative mess. to
Yeah, and it was
require
a bit of a scandal because, as you say, no one's quite sure what got miscoded or whatever, but all of a sudden the Republican Party, because it thought that the voters who had been disenfranchised in that instance might lean Republican. If you remember, all of a sudden the Republican Party became very forgiving and was like, well, we really shouldn't disenfranchise these people.
Right. They were like, we don't know that they've actually done anything wrong. This was a mistake of the state. We shouldn't punish voters for a mistake of the state, which is very funny because that's the opposite of the argument that they've been making in North Carolina in the state Supreme Court election contest there. We just did an update on that. You can click the link above to watch that video for the latest in North Carolina. But with DPOC, we've seen it enacted in New Hampshire and Arizona. Wyoming has enacted a DPOC law. The Texas legislature has been pushing a DPOC law very heavily this session.
I mean, come on, I can't imagine Ken Paxton and Governor Abbott are going to let some other state have a worse, more restrictive, more demonizing law than Texas.
It's almost amazing that Texas hasn't had this requirement yet, right? That they let Arizona and New Hampshire get to it before they did.
I feel like they're losing their game there.
I know. Texas legislature, step it up. Get back in the game. You're slacking. But yes, we have been seeing this in state after state. We've seen it in Congress. It is now a very popular talking point among Republicans. But Marc, we cannot say this enough. There is no proof that non-citizens are voting in any meaningful numbers in U.S. federal elections. It just does not happen, and it does not justify suppressing millions and millions of Americans with an arbitrary requirement to produce a certain set of documents that they may or may not have in order to continue to cast a ballot.
Right. And so look, Paige and I wanted to bring this breaking news to you as soon as it happened. And this is the reason why Democracy Docket is such a vital resource to all of you. So make sure you are already subscribed to this YouTube channel. And also take an opportunity now to make sure you're subscribed to Democracy Docket's free daily and weekly newsletters. The link to that is above and also in the show notes below. We will see you next time.